All right, today we're going to be talking about CJ Motorsports twin fuel pump hanger. Really badass unit, all billet anodized aluminum. We have one return port. We have the option of 2 outlet ports. Most of the time you're just going to use the one. It's going to be able to handle quite a bit of power, but you do have the ability to do a second port if you want to. So it is capped. It has all the return fittings that you need and the siphoning, so that it works just like the factory, so that it can basically siphon from the other side of the fuel tank into the passenger side, so which is very important. A lot of these kits that are out there, sometimes they ignore that, and you end up having an imbalance between fuels, between the saddles of the tank. So the other thing we're gonna be doing is this really badass. This was released sometime last year. We helped Charles over at CJM get this thing tested. Before, he just had the fuel pump assembly and it was just literally in the ocean of the fuel tank. So talk about fuel slosh. Fuel was not being contained where the pumps were, right? So your pumps go in here, literally fuel's just going everywhere. Charles released this bad boy using these really badass ball valves. So we're looking at this is basically the rear, if this was installed in the vehicle. And so these ball valves open and close based on what the vehicle is doing. So it allows fuel to go in and it prevents it from escaping as well. So the install on this is a little tricky. It's not horrible, but we're gonna cover that. We're gonna install it. This guy is actually gonna get dropped into the tank first, and then we actually have to put our float in afterwards. So it's a little bit of a multi-step process to get it and do it correctly. Once it's in, it works amazing. So say goodbye to fuel starvation, especially on those right-handers. It's gonna do really, really well. So we've actually been able to remove some of the anti-starvation kits that we've done in the past. And this is my preference. If you're gonna do a twin pump assembly and also get rid of the starvation, this is your answer right here. Look no further. You don't need to get complicated with other kits, adding another unit behind the driver's side. This will handle it all. So you can, of course, use this as a single pump configuration. You don't have to run 2 pumps if you don't want to. So if you're not going to be making, above 650 wheel, you could just do 1 pump. I do like the idea of having a second pump. And in this instance, this car already had the upgraded unit. It had the original CJM billet hat in the factory assembly, and we're going to be reusing this pump. This pump doesn't have too much time on it. The sock that was included with most of these kits we're not going to use. We're going to use these really badass small little stainless steel pre-filter socks so that everything can fit in there. The second pump, again, we're going to use another Walbro. This is a 520 Hellcat. This is only going to come on when it needs it. So to do that, we're going to use a hop switch. That hop switch is going to kick on at a predetermined boost setting, usually somewhere below 10 pounds of boost. And of course, you're going to need another relay. We like to use the Spall relays, 10 gauge wiring, really high quality units. They are a little pricey, but they're well worth the investment. This is your fuel system. This is your engine. You want to make sure that you're getting fuel when you need it, especially if you're running a twin pump configuration. Really easy for that second pump to fail or not work, and it could be just a bad ground. All the connectors we're gonna need inside and outside. Any sort of wiring issues is gonna give you big trouble. So we'll talk about all that. We have everything we need on the install, our fuel hoses, our favorite Oetiker clamps. This is the connection we're gonna need for the fuel level. And this is gonna be done again on the inside. So a little bit of a tricky install. And we also have the alignment dowels that we're gonna need to get this bad boy lined up so that when our hat goes in, this all bolts in. It's all gonna bolt in together. So we'll cover all that. So yeah, really stoked. This particular car is gonna be probably making somewhere around 700, maybe a little bit above that, we'll see. But it needs a second pump. The single pump is just gonna run out of fuel. We don't wanna be stressing the fuel system. We wanna make sure we have adequate fuel delivery. Otherwise, you're gonna run into a bunch of issues. we're going to start off with getting our pumps installed into the bracket. The very latest version of the kit uses O-rings to hold these pumps in. So just to make it a little easier, we're going to give these a little light coating. This will help us not completely fight the pumps going through there. So we're going to use the existing pump that came out of the assembly. It's another Hellcat. It's going to be our primary. Slip it in from the bottom. It is a snug fit. All right, so one pump. Now we'll get our second pump in. All right, so I'm going to have the outlets lined up so that's pretty much a straight shot into the inlet of the outlet assembly. So I'll move these bad boys out of the way. That, prep our hoses and get our Oetiker clamps. All right, so I'm going to use some of the assembly lube on these barb fittings, and if it's way too tight, then we'll use the heat gun on our hoses. So we'll give this a shot. Make sure you get your clamp on first. The hose I'm using today is a little bit on the long side. Thankfully it's corrugated, and that's slipped on, and then we'll go in like that, which is fine. This part of the install is going to be the easiest by far. It's installing the canister that's going to be the fun part. Get our pliers. All right, so install the first pumps hose next. All right, guys, so we're going to move on to the wiring portion on the inside of the assembly. We're going to take the old connection that was off the old CJM billet hat. That's going to work the same. It's already set up for the primary pump. We're going to leave that as is. Since there are only 6 connections, however, you're no longer going to be able to use the fuel temp sensor. So this guy, save it for a rainy day for now. It's not going to be going back in, okay? Because we're going to have 2 more for the secondary pump and then for our level sending unit. So that's going to take up all of the wiring pinouts. Because of how tight everything is, the CJM kit provides a connection for the float. So basically, this stuff is going to go in after you get this hat in. So this is where the install gets a little more difficult, but you're going to drop this bad boy in. Once you drop it in, you're going to bolt the setup, the float, to the unit, and you're doing this all inside that little hole that you've got for the fuel tank there. So we'll go through that, but this is going to get pinned out to our connector and for our second pump. So we're going to go ahead and do that using the provided terminals. We'll go ahead and we'll start with our fuel pump. So you'll have the larger terminals. This is what you're going to want to use for your 14 gauge and higher wiring. And then there's also the smaller terminals as well, which you're going to use for like the sensors. So in this instance, it's going to be for the float. So we've gone ahead and already pinned the connector for the float. So it's standalone just like that. This is provided with the kit. We just need to do the other portion, which is going to connect here. Okay, so we'll do that after we get our fuel pump connector for the second pump all set up here. And there you have it. Okay, we've got our connector all pinned out, both our pumps, our secondary connector for the float. We've got our locking tab in place. We can go ahead, get this installed. This is for our primary pump, and I always recommend taking a photo or having a schematic of how you have everything wired on this side of the connector. That way, when everything's installed, you're not going to have a brain fart and worried about how you need to pin out the external connector. So the connection point's always going to be opposite on the outside. So from inside to outside, it's going to be opposite pin out. Okay, and so since everything's going to be really tight, we're going to kind of bunch all this stuff together cleanly, and this guy is going to make its connection on the outside. So this is going to be coming out of the top of the canister when it's installed. Okay, the twin pump assembly has our float bracket attached to it. So we're going to remove it. This is if you're going to install the twin pump assembly without the canister. So we're going to remove this. You're not going to reuse these bolts that it came with. You're going to use the ones that came off the canister. So we've removed them for now. They're right here. You can see the difference in the length. So these are the ones we're going to be using. They came off this canister. Okay. So this can't go in yet. We need to get this in first. Once we get it in to the tank, then we can go ahead and install this bad boy. So we're basically at that point. Everything's all wired up. This is all ready to be installed. So we're gonna go ahead and go to the really fun part, getting this thing in. All right, so we're ready to drop this bad boy in. Before we do that though, we've gone ahead, we've removed the fuel level float bracket that comes off the twin pump assembly. That's gonna go on later, and that's gonna bolt to the back over here. And the other thing we need to do is remove these top hat bolts that are here. And the reason why is they're made to bolt through the top of these little towers that we have here. Because basically, once it's all in, we're gonna bolt this thing down. We have a stud, a locating stud that's gonna be in there temporarily when it goes in. And one tip is when you are going to remove these bolts, don't use the Allen, use a wrench or a socket to remove the nut, because you'll just break your Allen tool or your Allen socket. So these are gonna go away. The canister is gonna have its own new hardware. You're not gonna reuse this stuff. You're basically gonna reuse this bolt and the included washer with it. So these guys are what's gonna go through here, okay? So we're just gonna demo how this is all gonna go together. So this is the one tower is gonna go facing towards the front of the car. And one piece that we're not able to mimic is our siphon hose. We'll show you how that goes in. This is gonna make the install even more complicated since it's gonna be in the car. And this is where this stud is important, right? So you're basically can't see anything at this point. So you're just gonna be wiggling and top hat around to get it to line up to that stud. And so with that stud in place, you can go ahead and install your new Allen bolt hardware. That's gonna go in there and attach. So once you've got these two finger tight, you can go ahead and remove the locating stud, and then you'll bolt it all down. Once that's bolted down, you can go ahead and get all your little bolts that secure the top hat to the top of the tank. So we're gonna go ahead and install this bad boy now. We've gone ahead, drained all the fuel out of our tank, cleaned the inside of the tank, we've wiped it clean. We're gonna go ahead and drop this in. Here's the moment of joy. We're gonna go ahead and get this canister in first, get our bracket in for our float, clip it into place, and then we can put our twin pump in, get our siphon hose in, and then we'll show you how we get that routed to make it as easy as possible. All right, drop this bad boy in, and there's just barely enough room to get it through. I can see where it's having a little bit of an issue, and that's just with one of the welds. I'm gonna try and snake it past there. Like I said, it's nice and tight. We're going to lay it back up so we can get access and lay him in there like that. We can go ahead and tighten up the hardware for the float bracket. Careful not to cut yourself. Inside portion of the opening of the tank is sharp, and I've done it before. Okay, and there we go. You can see why we have to install all the float assembly and pieces after the fact, because there's no way you can just snake it in. It's just impossible. It's just impossible. So we'll get our bolts threaded in. All right. Threads in easily, you know you did a good job. The right hardware. All right, guys, so we've got all our bolts in for the top hat to the fuel tank. We're just tightening them up right now. We got them all in by hand. They're all tight. Now we're gonna go ahead and finish tightening up the 3 bolts, securing the top hat to our fuel pump canister. Kind of go equally. Go ahead and tighten them. Don't have to go too crazy. And there you have it. So we just need to finish our wiring on the external connector. We'll get our fuel pump hose connected. This is our out arrow going out, so it's coming from the pumps. And then we will hook up our fitting for the return going to the factory line, which used to be the feed that's been repurposed. We'll double check to make sure all this stuff is tight, and we're done. So the install of the twin pump canister and assembly is in, ready to go. We'll finish our wiring and then we'll get this thing on the dyno. You can see that I've gone ahead and we've removed this panel here. This makes it way easier so you don't have this part of the interior blocking and fighting you a little bit. It's a little bit more work, but trust me, take the extra few minutes to do that so that you're not totally beating your head against the wall. All right, we'll get the last remaining bolts in, tighten those down. All right, guys, so a couple of tips. I like to use a little bit of anti-seize on the threads of all the aluminum AN stuff, just so it doesn't gall. So I've got some here, I've got some here. We'll go ahead and thread them in. We'll also get those O-rings lubricated so that they don't pinch, and we'll tighten this stuff up. And then here's a little tip that I like to do when installing this. So we remove this fitting, which is for the return. Getting it in and threading it in and then trying to get the hose in is going to be way too difficult. So what you want to do is pop it in first, and you'll see that this is going to rotate. So this is going to make it a lot easier. It's still not the easiest job, but way easier than trying to get the hose in after. And then you can line up the threads, and then you can start threading the AN into the return port on the top hat. You can see how much easier it is to do it this way than trying to put the fitting in and then the hose after the fact. All right, there you have it. And then we'll apply a little bit of anti-seize to the male AN. Tighten it up, and we'll be good to go. We'll double check that plug as well.